Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for participating in our webinar today, which is the second webinar in our series on resilience. And before we start, I have to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Roberta Capello. She's a full professor at the Politecnico University of Milan in regional economics, and her scientific works are often about regional growth, innovation, and agglomeration economies and cities. And also, what is today's issue is regional forecasting models. So after Professor Capello's presentation, we will have time for a little Q&A. You can, if you have a question, you can post it in the chat or ask it directly via the video. And until then, it would be great if everybody could mute their microphones. We minimize the background noise. All right, now the floor is open for the presentation. And thank you very much for the participation, Professor Capello. We very much appreciate that.
Thanks, it's my pleasure. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming and listening to this seminar via the web. It's my first time, so not as a seminar, but as a webinar. So I'm pleased to do this experience with you. So I'm going to speak to you about a program, a research program that we are developing since more than 15 years here at Politecnico in the group of regional and urban economics at the Politecnico of Milano. And in particular, this research program is to put in place a methodology to build sound and as much as possible acceptable methodologically sound scenarios. The problem of looking forward for economists in general has always been something very important. We speak about predictions, we speak about forecasts, we speak about foresights. We have many different quality and quantitative methodologies that try to capture what will happen in the future in order, of course, to raise awareness among policymakers on the problems that can take place in the future. So we decided some years ago, as I said, nearly 20 years ago, to put in place our own methodology. So this is what I will go and tell you and speak about, and I will present, of course, an application of the methodology to some scenarios that we built just recently for within a big research international project that was run for DG Regio and for ESPON, which is a European Spatial Observatory Network of Territorial Problems. So the methodology, as I said, if you look into the literature, there are two types of methodologies that provide two completely different outcomes. The first group is about what we call forecasts. So they are methodologies that aim at giving an idea of what will the economic trajectory will look like in the short run, in the future, but in a very recent future, in a very short run, with a very short run perspective. So we speak about forecasts when we say 3 months, 6 months, maximum 1 year. And we provide estimates of precise numbers, quantitative numbers of what the GDP, for example, will look like in over the next month or maximum 1 year. On the other side, we have what they are called foresights, that is to say, qualitative visions of what the long run perspective will be, given some big changes in the trajectories. These changes are usually technological. If we assume that in the future we can have a very radical technological change, what the economy will look like. They are qualitative in nature, and they are also a little bit of a, let's say, of a crystal balls approach. So there is nothing really serious, but there are reflections on the impact that a big change, which can be again a technological change, a natural change. Let's think about a natural disaster. If something happens in a location, what changes? Climate change. So if we think about these big changes in the natural, in the nature and in the way in which it evolves, what happens to local economies? Our approach is in between. So we have scenarios that are not foresights, because as you will see, we are not looking into a crystal ball, but we have strong and solid econometric exercise on the one hand, producing a sort of qualitative results that are provided in numbers. So we will have numbers that tell us the trends that will take place. So they have to be analyzed not for the number that they represent, but for the trend that they produce, and it will become easier while we speak. So we have some steps in our methodology. So the first one is to think about an idea, what we call a seminal idea, on the driving forces that we believe will characterize the future economic territorial development. So we have to start from some assumptions, from an idea of what we want to see in terms of driving forces of change. Then on the basis of these driving forces, we look at the characteristics that this scenario will have. So let's assume that we think about an integration, as we will see. We will have a scenario, what we call an integration scenario in Europe. So we think that Europe is able to go against the present tendency of fragmentation in national areas, and instead will be able to integrate the socio-economic sphere more than it is now. So that's the driving force of our scenario. So the characteristics of the scenario will be based on the elements, the conditional elements that allow to arrive to this integration. So if we think that there is an integration, we assume a higher integration. This means that there will be conditional elements in order to drive the economies towards these innovations. And these, let's say, these are the assumptions behind the scenarios that allow the scenario to lead, to go into the direction that we have. And then these assumptions are qualitative assumptions. We will say that these are, for example, in order to lead, we assume that there is higher integration, which means that we assume that there is higher trade. Goods will be traded more than now. So that's a qualitative assumption behind our scenario. These assumptions is transformed by us into a quantitative number that is inserted into an econometric model. And this is our big issue. So this econometric model allows us to link the cause-effect chain according to a structural equations to what we will see as assume these independent variables to have an effect on some dependent variables according to the structure that are, to the structural relationships that are estimated in the model. And we get the results out of the model. That will become clearer after that. So what is a scenario? A scenario is an integrated vision of different driving forces. So we will have different types of assumptions that have to be extremely consistent one another. And that's the difficulty in building a scenario. So we have to be sure that the individual driving forces have to be related to each other. So, and they don't have to, let's say, go one against the other. So they have to be consistent and to be logic one another. Then we have to be clear of what we have to be very logic in assuming that there is an if-then effect. So we have to be sure that we don't assume something that is then leads immediately to the output. So the assumptions have to be completely separated to the output. So we don't have to assume that we expect cities to grow more than the rural areas. And then what you get is exactly what you assume. So there is no logic behind that. There is the assumptions contain already the results, which is stupid. So you have to be sure that the assumptions are completely separated from the effects that they produce. And the assumptions should be separated. If you build two scenarios, you have to be sure that the scenarios are very, very much separated one another by assuming the completely different assumptions so that you can compare them. Otherwise, you are lost. Okay. Again, this is a word of cautiousness that we put because you will see the results, and we produce thanks to our econometric model, which is called MASST. And MASST stands for Macroeconomic, Sectoral, and Social and Territorial Regional Forecasting Model. So it's an acronym for the condition, let's say the characteristics that are typical of our model. So it provides numbers, but these numbers represent main tendencies or major adjustments to change. And they are very interesting because you can compare and you can relate one trend in some areas with the other trends in other areas. But they are conditional foresights. They are not forecasts. Why? Because this is not the way in which you forecast the future. So the short-term trend. These are tendencies and the relative behavioral path of regional GDP growth in each individual region under certain conditions, i.e. under the assumptions that we do. So the MASST model. As you see, we are already at the 4th version of the MASST, and MASST has already a long history behind. The first version, well, as you see, the team is very tiny. There are only 4 people or 4 or 5 people behind, but it's the way in which we work. So we are a very small group, but we produce a big, something that sometimes is made by many other people, by larger groups. So MASST is started in 2003, and the first version was published in 2005, 2007, I think. But so in that year, we have the first basic version. And in every version, we were able to expand a part. So for example, in the second version, we introduced in a more finer way the sectoral dimension. So we introduced the sectors that were not so present before. Then in 2013, we found a way to measure the crisis. In 2008, 2009, we had the big crisis that started. So we had to re-estimate everything and to find a way of introducing the crisis in the, and we endogenize the public expenditure, we endogenize urbanization economies, and all these types of advancements. Now we are in the fourth version, where we expanded a lot. For example, we endogenized not only innovation, but the innovation dynamics of regions. So the way in which innovation changes the capacity to innovate and the type of innovation that it produces. We have refinement of urban economy, urbanization economies. We endogenize the regional productivity, and we, of course, full-fledged panel estimates for regional submodel. That was not the case before. What are the distinct characteristics of the MASST model? The MASST model has a peculiarity that is characterizes and distinguishes it from other from other regional growth models. And this is that within the same model, you find macroeconomic elements. So we have all the aggregate demand, so the behavior of single national countries, economies, the national economies, and at the same time we have regional elements and even urban elements. So urbanization economies explain why a region, so are, let's say, taken into consideration in the fact that a region can grow more than its nation. So it is based on a strong interaction between macroeconomic and territorial elements. This means that the model overcomes the bottom-up or top-down dichotomy. You have models that deal with the nations and the way the nations grow, and then subdivides the growth, the national growth at the regional level by looking at the weight that each region has in the development. And this is the top-down approach. Then we have, on the other side, a bottom-up approach, which is instead to look at the way in which regions grow, and then you arrive to have the national development, the national growth via the sum of all different regional growth. Here we have both at the same time, which is something very peculiar. And another peculiar thing is that we have cooperation among regions, because we keep into consideration the fact that regions are part of, are not standalone economies, but they might be beneficial, they might create benefit and get benefit from the cooperation with other regions. So we have growth spillovers, effects that are taken into consideration. So we have interregional cooperation. But then we also model competition among regions, because we have, if we take up the bottom-up perspective, then it means that we are looking at why a region is able to grow more than another region. And this means that we have competition at the same time. Just to look at what we model is regional growth. You see there in the box. Regional growth is the outcome of the main outcome of the model. So how much regions grow in terms of GDP. But this is the result of a national growth, and this national growth is explained via a macroeconomic growth model. So we have all the national part, this is something that we have to remind, a region growth because, first of all, because it is part of a nation. So I doubt that there is no situations where a region can, let's say, behave completely different from its nation. The national rules, the national economic situation influences regions a lot. So we will never have Lombardy, where Milan lies, behaving completely different like as Italy does, because unfortunately the Italian situation influences the regions, and that's why we think that is absolutely necessary to have the nation and the way in which the nations on board behave on board. And this is especially true for the period of crisis that we had. But we can have, and this is again extremely interesting, regional growth differentials, which means that a region can grow more or less with respect to its nation. And this difference, so this differential growth, is explained by a supply side approach. That is to say, by elements, by resources that are present in the region and that are more, let's say, exploited in a region than in another region. So it's a matter of endowment, resource endowment, and it's a matter of exploiting these resources better in regions with respect to other regions. So these elements of what is called territorial capital, which is recently being defined as all resources, all types of resources that are available in a region in order to grow. Sorry. So that's the structure. As you can see, we have some the rectangular are the exogenous variables, and you can see that we have some of them. Then we have endogenous variables, and we have different equations that are the models that are signed there. So this is the big flow chart. Every gray box is an equation that explains different elements. I don't know, we have here the differential component is explained by the innovativeness of the regions, and again the innovativeness of the region is explained by the presence of human capital, the presence of R&D activities, and by the type of innovation pattern that the region has, and this innovation pattern is explained on its turn by others. So as you see, it is a matter of, here we have, here urbanization economies, so how much urban productivity explains regional performance, regional differential performance, and these urbanization economies are captured via another equation where we have urbanization economy, so a capacity of a city to be more productive, that depends on many other aspects, and on this also on an element that comes from another one, and so on. So that's to give you an idea. Okay, if you have questions, I don't know, I hope I am clear enough. On the other side here, we have macroeconomic elements. We have the national growth that is explained via a change in internal consumption, and this internal consumption is explained on its turn via the change in the national GDP as in a Keynesian approach, typical Keynesian approach, and the tax rates. Here we have the changes in investments that depend on the change in investment in interest rates, unit labor cost, and which represents the opposite of competitiveness. The higher the increase in unit labor cost, the lower the competitiveness of the country. And we have also foreign direct investments. And so the change in the stock of foreign direct investment that explains investments. Imports, again, is changed by many other aspects. So that's very traditional, but very important at the same time. All regional equations are estimated into 3 periods of time: the pre-crisis period from 2002 to 2006, the crisis period 2006-2010, and the post-crisis period 2010-2014. The national model is instead estimated in panel form with yearly data covering from the period 1995 to 2015. So we have here, okay, a panel of 3 periods. Here we have a yearly data panel. So why? Because the availability of data at regional level for all Europe is extremely complicated to be built, and the availability is what we have, even if this is a demand side approach. So you have an aggregate demand that is very volatile. It changes according to the economic situation. So you need yearly data to cover the short-term changes. While this is a structure, it represents the supply, so it represents the structure of the region. So the structural changes take place not every year, so it's not a big problem if we cover 3 different periods. As I said, these are a little bit the equations, so I just give you a hints, but then you have a lot of publications on which you can see we come up with the change in GDP at the regional level, which is, as I said, the sum of the change in GDP at the national level plus a shift, a total shift of the region with respect to its nation. Here we have the different components. These are all the equations. It's not a matter of getting through. And we have, in particular, a very important, we expanded a lot the public expenditure side, because in the first 2 versions, this was exogenous, so it was given. And instead, it is an extremely important variable. It's very difficult to, it depends on very important elements like, for example, the debt that countries have, the public debts, the public deficit, and the far the countries are to the Maastricht parameters. So the austerity measures that were imposed during the crisis to, for example, to countries that had public debt and public deficits, restricted a lot their possibilities to expand and to recover from the crisis, to be resilient to the crisis. And this is something that had to be endogenized, and this is the way in which we did. So we have GDP, an expenditure, a public expenditure change that it depends on the constant, something that is not depending on nothing else, but also on the difference between the deficit over GDP that a nation has and the target that we want to assume. And here we put, for example, the target that were decided by the European Union, so the 3%. So the deficit over GDP minus the target explains the possibility of for a country to expand a GDP. Then the output gap and the change in the GDP of the previous year. So the output gap is defined in this model. I don't want to enter the detail, but there is a way to define it, which is the difference between the potential and the actual GDP of a country. And that's the way in which we built. The deficit on its turn, this one, is typically this is in outcome how to say, expenditure, public expenditures minus the entry. So we have the GDP minus plus the what is paid in interest rates on the expenditures, on the debt, sorry, this is the debt that the country has, multiplied by the interest rates on bond that we have, divided by GDP and multiplied by GDPs, minus the entries that are the tax rates multiplied by GDP. That's simple. We have on the regional side instead the difference, the regional growth differential, which is explained by the sum of 2 components. One is what we call the intrasectoral productivity, which depend, I don't know whether you are familiar with the shift share analysis, but this is the mix, which means the mix of sectors that you have in, and the way in which these sectors grow. It's the employment in the different sectors, tertiary or industrial sectors, and this explains your intra-sectoral productivity. And then we have the part that is linked to the intersectoral productivity that depends on the innovation, on traditional agglomeration economies, urbanization economies, spillovers, human capital, on all accessibility, trust, so all other elements that we have. I don't get into the details, but at the end, we can have these are again what I mentioned. Here, it's the idea of innovation. Innovation is, as I said, is made dependent on R&D, and it's also made dependent on the way in which regions innovate. This is comes from another project of us. We believe that we strongly believe, and we found out that this is true empirically, that each region has what we call its pattern of innovation. So there are regions that innovate through innovation, through R&D, because they are able to produce their own knowledge and turn this knowledge into innovation. So the difference between knowledge and innovation is that you need to commercialize, to be able to commercialize your new knowledge into a product or a process. So there are regions that are able to do that, so they know how to exploit R&D and to turn R&D into innovation and growth. There are other regions instead that are absolutely unable to, let's say, exploit. And so, sorry, I forgot to say, in empirical terms, we found out that there are two groups of regions that are able to exploit R&D. One that are regions that produce basic or let's call generic, general purpose technologies and knowledge in general purpose technologies. And then there are regions that develop their knowledge in applied science. And this was made via indicators in terms of patent indicators. And then we have other regions that instead are able to innovate, but are unable to produce knowledge, and they get knowledge from outside. And they are able to innovate and to commercialize new knowledge that comes from outside. So they are able to exploit R&D that comes from outside. And these two are different types of the ways in which knowledge is taken from outside. So in this pattern, you have knowledge that comes from outside that is inbuilt in some technologies. So you buy the technologies and you know the knowledge. Here, it's a matter of tacit knowledge. So you get in contact and you are able to get via tacit exchange of tacit knowledge, you get new knowledge and you innovate. And then there is a situation where there are regions that don't know what to do at all of R&D. They don't know how to commercialize them. And these are the regions that imitate innovations that's already being produced outside. So they do, for example, these are the less creative regions, and these are the lagging regions that have a high attractiveness, for example, of FDI, and they know new knowledge via FDI. So here we have some, and we also found out that we also assumed, sorry, going back, that we have a probability for regions to change their way of their pattern of innovation. And so we inserted a probability of for regions to be able to change from one pattern to another. we have, well, this is the urban size. So within regions, within the model, we have 175 large cities, and we built for them a huge database in terms of amenities, the diversity, density, the functions that they host, the networking capacity of these regions, the cost of living in these cities, the malaise and the sprawl that these cities have. And by looking at the positive and negative, so the benefits of location in these cities and the negative, so the cost of location in these cities, we have what we call the equilibrium city size. So a city size, an urban size that is able to balance the positive and the negative costs, and these are some. Then in the recent period, we also had to measure Brexit. So we had to introduce the Brexit phenomenon into the model. So we did that by having, by simulating, but that's in simulation, not in the estimation. We assume that the distance between UK and all other countries calculated, this distance is calculated in geographic, as a geographic distance, and in the possibility to trade. We have an input-output matrix at regional level, covering the exchange at sectoral level, the exchange of goods among all NUTS 2 regions in Europe. We assume that these trade metrics becomes very, very low when Brexit enters, is in place. So we assume that from 2020 onwards, we have a strong increase both in geographical terms and in trade with the UK. And then we also have another variable, which is called the border variable, that measures the presence of a border, of an international borders among countries, among European countries. Unfortunately, this comes from another work that we did. The border effect is still there. Even if we have the European Union, when you measure the capacity of these of border regions to grow, you find that these regions have a bias, have a handicap in being close to an international border, which means that they are hampered in their growth by the presence of the border. And this is true also for the UK. So we assume that this border is even stronger when the Brexit is in place. Then the simulation part. This is the estimation part. In the simulation part, we move to the simulation part by defining, as I said at the beginning, and describing the initial condition and values for the simulation. So we have the values of the exogenous variable of the model that can be changed according to the possibility of the assumptions that we do. And we create, we say, okay, this variable will change because of this assumption and will achieve this type of value. And so we insert in the simulation a new value for the variables that we want to change because of our assumptions. So I get quick, the target can differ according to the countries, according to the types of countries we have, according to the types of regions, and so on. So the model is able, as I said, to provide you GDP growth, industrial employment growth, service employment growth, and population growth at all aggregate EU levels, at the national level and for regional level. We have the different types of levers that we can change are the interest rates. So we can say that these change No, these can be the levels of the model. We can give these variables a different level so that we can assume different trajectories for these variables. And we can also decide whether we have the length of the crisis if we go back into a crisis in a certain period and when we come out of the crisis. So we can decide that. These are the levels at the regional level. These are all levels at the regional level. And these are the levels at the urban level. I wanted to show you, I go quickly, sorry if I jump, but to the example. So if we want to build a scenario, which is what we call a reference scenario. So we assume that what is happening now will continue in the future. So the changes that we had during the post-crisis will continue in the future. We have the qualitative assumptions here, as you see, we assume that assumptions on the macroeconomic trends, we assume high volatility of investments, we see these are some variables that we assume, low inflation rates and so on. Each assumption finds a lever in the model that can reflect such assumption by changing it. And these are the quantitative assumptions. So we translate the qualitative assumption via the levers into new quantitative value of these variables. And this is why, for example, here we assume that there is a permanent control on national deficit and debts, which means that the targets on deficit and debts will remain the same. And these are the targets that we assume. These are the qualitative assumptions for at the regional level, and so we go on in building that. And these are the results of the reference scenario. We have the European Union that will grow at 1.6, which is not a forecast. It's a trend, so it will grow like that, but we can say that the EU 27 without UK will grow at the same time. But what comes out, which is a very important message, is that the United Kingdom will grow less than Europe as a whole. So that's the message to the UK. If you leave Europe, you will grow less than the Europe as a whole. We can split the growth into two, the old and the new countries, and we can see that the new countries, so the Eastern countries, will still grow a little bit more than the old countries, but not so much as before. Here we are. These are the messages. These are the national growth rate, and this was for Italy. I was showing that Italy is growing at the EU average. And again, the Brexit effect is there. So the UK loses. This is the GDP growth rate at regional level. And so you can see that in general, large cities and metro areas like Paris here, they, although they still perform well, are not necessarily the most dynamic areas in their country. So we don't grow thanks to the cities. And there is a vast diffusion of new technology and organizational innovation that will work and will create a solid mid-income regions and medium city size growth. This is the way in which the disparities will grow, and this is the between country disparities. So we will have a decrease in between country disparities, but with an increase in within country disparities. This is the Kyle index, so that the interregional total shift will be like that. And then we had the integration scenario, as I said. We have a simulation that is based on the following assumption: higher trade flows among EU countries, higher decrease in non-tariff barriers, higher trust within and among countries, higher quality of government, stronger cooperation networks among cities, higher export and as in the reference, Brexit will take place in 2020. So that's remained the same. Here we transfer this assumption into quantitative levels of the model, and the results is this one. This is the way in which GDP will grow in the integration scenario with respect to the reference. So with respect to the one that I showed you before. So as you see, there is the integration scenario is an expansionary scenario. So the GDP grows more than in the reference scenario. The UK, where the GDP in the UK, sorry, in the EU 27 without the UK will still grow a lot, and the eastern countries will grow more. What is interesting is that all countries gain, so it's a plus for everybody, even for the UK, who is instead is the country that registered the lowest GDP growth. Again, in assuming the capacity of Europe to be more integrated, the United Kingdom will get much less from this. Here we are, from this. And here is the annual average GDP growth. I forgot to say that this is between 2018 and 2035. So it's like 11, some 15 or a little bit more years. So the integration scenario versus the reference scenario. And this, there is a very important message, because it's the yellow one here, the regions in yellow are those that gain less in an integrated scenario with respect to an integrated scenario. So what we are claiming is that if at the national level everybody gains more than the reference scenario, in the integration scenario some regions lose, and these are the regions that are unable to adjust to get to the advantages of an integration. But as it is interesting to see, this happens especially in the UK, where the barriers of Brexit are built. Here we were able to show what with these types of the different types of advantages that each part of Europe got. So that's another interesting result is that if we look at the total disparities and the regional disparities in general, the dotted line is the one for the integration scenario. So we expected before running this is that the integration brings to leads to lower disparities. Instead, what it says here is that in the long run, disparities will, even if this is very tiny, but disparities will be higher than the reference scenario. And again, this is typical because if you integrate, you get more competition. You allow more competition in the market. And this means that the strongest areas will be able to grow more than the weakest areas. So the conclusions are the ones that I showed you already, and I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Capello.
You are welcome. Hope I was able to be clear, at least a little bit clear.
No, it was very clear. So now there's some time, not that much, but some time for questions and answers. If you have a question, you can type it in the chat right now or talk via the video, and we'll try to address them. Just waiting for some questions to come. They're all thinking hard, so I'm going to start. So I was wondering, what kind of, so since you're expecting that disparities within countries are going to increase from this integration and competition effect, what kind of policies would you suggest, or would you suggest any policies at all?
Well, I would suggest that this stresses the fact that we need structural funds and we need cohesion policies, because if we open to competition, weaker regions have to become stronger, and regional disparities are there. They are not solved through the market. Policy, cohesion policies are extremely important and have to be taken into consideration. So the first step of integration is that someone loses. So the weaker lose, the weaker regions will lose. This doesn't mean that in the long run they cannot recover. But again, these have to be helped by specific structural policies that, as the word says, they should help these regions to make their structure, their markets become stronger and being able to compete better than they do now.
All right, thank you very much. And we have one question here from Anastasios. So he's saying, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if the model can offer at the moment insights on what the drivers of the reduced growth would be in the Brexit scenarios. So, for example, less migration, less patenting, etc.
Well, yeah, we could build a scenario of, let's say, a Brexit scenario, only a Brexit scenario. We did that and it's published in a paper. Sorry, probably I just not for marketing my own work, but for you, if you are interested here, I have these are grouped in terms of, you have the technicalities of the three versions of the model. Here you have the scenarios, and in the case of the demand of the question that was raised now, we have a publication especially on what, no, it's not listed here, it's on what happens, it's on papers in regional science, and it's on the effect of Brexit on the future of Europe. So we measured the effect of Brexit on the regions, on the UK regions, and on all other regions, because that's the point. Brexit does not affect only UK on its own, but it will reflect in a different spatial way, in a heterogeneous, spatially heterogeneous way, the regions. So there will be regions in Europe that will be strongly affected by, more than others, by Brexit. So we measure that, and it's possible to be built and to be simulated.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question by Daniela. She's interested in the first figure where you mentioned a model of employment growth, the one that explains industrial employment growth. Mm-hmm. And she was wondering which model of employment growth did you use?
Well, we used, where is it? We estimated industrial employment growth as dependent on, I'm trying to remember, because on the specialization of the region and the way in which this specialization changes and the functions that are present. So there are, if we go in detail, there are differences, and this is because we are, let's say, we believe on the fact that specialization and the change in specialization are extremely important to explain the dynamics of the labor market. So that was the case. This goes back to the second version of MASST, so it means more than 10 years ago. I have to admit that I don't remember exactly the choices that we did. So we are speaking about a lot of work in a long time period. So I don't remember exactly when, sorry, what we did, but you can find explanations in the specific publications. So sorry for that, but that was and I remember that we also did a lot on the constant. The constant can change according to, so that we can say, if we assume that a sector will grow in Europe, you see here, that's the employment in a sector, in the different sectors in Europe. So we can simulate what happens to each region if, for example, the industry, the 4.0 industry increases in jobs and creates new jobs. What happens to the employment, the general employment in the different regions according to the specialization of the weight of these this sector in the region. So it took us to do that something like 2 months, 10 years ago. So I don't remember, but I remember we worked a lot on that, and then now it's we can play with that in a simulation exercise.
Okay, thank you very much. One last question by Igor. He's asking, is it possible to see some correlation between these predicted regional growth within UK and the regional support for Brexit? Looking at your map, it seems, for example, that Scotland's regions are expected to present a lower GDP growth rate.
Yeah, well, in the integration scenario, it depends on which scenario you look at, because also in the reference we had Brexit. And in the reference we had a different map. I know that in two days we will have a seminar here with Andrés Rodriguez Pose speaking about the famous, here we are. That's another map, so that's the reference scenario, and here we still have Brexit. The difference between this map and the other one is that in the other one we simulate also a higher integration among European countries. Here we have, so I was saying we will have a seminar on the places that do not matter, which are the places that voted for Brexit. That's the idea of Andrés Rodriguez Pose. Here we have, let's say, some regions that lose with respect to others. We wanted to compare the results with the places that do not matter, also by looking at the other regions where there are countries where this nationalism increases and see whether they can relate. We haven't done it so far. I don't think that this is exactly what, because I think these were mainly, so the voters for Brexit were concentrated in the rural part, which is here, but I don't remember exactly the map and we have not related that with the places that do not matter of Andrés. We will do that in 2 days.
All right. Thank you very much for your presentation and answering the questions.
My pleasure.
More, but we are actually perfectly on time now.
Okay.
So yes, thank you again, and thanks to all the participants.
Thank you for listening.
For being here. And keep in mind, there are more webinars coming, so these were just the second one. The next one is going to be in June by Pierre-Alex Ballin from Utrecht University. And yeah, hope to see you all there again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for organizing, Simone. Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for participating.
Bye. Thank you for listening to all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.